The morphine syringe was already out of the pouch before the American even reached him. That was what stayed with Gefreiter Ernst Kemper long after the war, longer than the wound itself, longer than the weeks in the transit camp that followed, not the fact of the treatment. Not the efficiency of it, the way the medic's hands moved without hesitation through the field dressing, the tourniquet, the injection. What stayed with him was the moment just before. The two Americans the medic had stepped over to get to him, both of them wounded, both of them watching, neither of them saying a word. Kemper had been with the 194th Panzergrenadier Regiment in Tunisia when an artillery round caught his section in the open. 3 men died immediately. He took fragments through the upper thigh and lost consciousness before he hit the ground. When he came around, the firefight had moved, the smoke was different, and a man in a helmet he didn't recognize was kneeling over him speaking a language he couldn't understand. He assumed he was a prisoner. He assumed the treatment would come later, or not at all. In his experience, and in everything he had been told about how these situations resolved, wounded came in a specific order. Your men first. Theirs after. If there was time, if there were resources, if the situation permitted. That was not cruelty. That was logic. That was how a fighting force sustained itself. What he didn't know, lying in the Tunisian dust in the spring of 1943, was that the man working on his leg had no discretion in the matter. Not because he was ordered at that moment by a superior officer standing over him. Not because Kemper had said something, or moved in a way that communicated urgency, or been identified as a source of useful intelligence. The medic had no discretion because the United States Army Medical Corps had spent years building a doctrine that removed nationality from the triage calculation entirely, had trained its men to execute that doctrine under fire, and had instilled it deeply enough that it did not require a conscious decision at the point of application. The most critically wounded man got treated first. That was the protocol. Kemper was the most critically wounded man. The 2 Americans the medic had stepped over had gunshot wounds to the shoulder and the calf, respectively. They could wait 4 minutes. Kemper could not. This was not mercy. It was arithmetic. The distinction matters because the German military medical system was not, on paper, barbaric. The Wehrmacht had its own field medical corps, its own trained sanitator, its own stated commitment to the Geneva Convention. German field surgeons were frequently skilled. German medical units occasionally treated Allied wounded with genuine professionalism. None of this is in dispute. What is in dispute, and what post-war accounts make unmistakable, is how consistently the principle held under pressure. The German system in practice, particularly in conditions of heavy casualties or supply constraint, operated according to a priority order that ran along national and, in some theatres, racial lines. German wounded first, Allied wounded after, Soviet wounded, in some contexts, not at all. This was not always a formal policy handed down in writing. It was a set of assumptions embedded in institutional culture, and those assumptions reflected something real about the framework within which German military medicine operated. A fighting force existed to sustain itself. Medical resources existed to sustain the fighting force. The fighting force was German. The logic followed naturally. American Army Medical Corps doctrine had arrived at a different logic through a different route. The triage principles codified in field manuals by the 1940s derived from a pragmatic reading of mass casualty management going back to the work of military surgeons in the First World War and refined through the interwar. Period. The underlying argument was not humanitarian in the first instance, though it produced humanitarian outcomes. It was operational. In a mass casualty situation, if you treated the most severely wounded regardless of other factors, you maximized the number of men who survived. Treating a lightly wounded man first because he was on your side, while a more severely wounded man of any nationality died next to him, was operationally wasteful. The field manual said so in terms close to those. Medics trained on it until the reflex was pre-verbal. German medical officers who encountered American practice at close quarters, either as prisoners or through post-war interviews conducted by historians in the 1950s and 60s, described a consistent difficulty in categorizing what they were seeing. Several noted that the American system was difficult to explain within the conceptual vocabulary available to them. Was it religious? The Americans were, in the German perception, a more overtly Christian military culture than the Wehrmacht had become by the early 1940s. Was it ideological, some expression of the democratic universalism that American propaganda claimed to represent? Was it simply naivety, an inability to make the hard calculations that total war required? None of those explanations quite fit, because the men applying the doctrine were not doing so out of visible sentiment. They were doing it the way they set up a radio or cleaned a weapon. It was procedure. The procedure happened to treat enemy wounded as equivalent inputs to a medical calculation. The German officers found this, in the precise meaning of the word, incomprehensible. The first place the collision between these two systems became visible at scale was North Africa in the spring of 1943. By April, the Axis position in Tunisia was collapsing. The fall of the Mareth Line in late March had broken the southern defence, and the Allied squeeze from east and west was compressing what remained of Army Group Africa into a diminishing perimeter around Tunis and Bizerte. German and Italian units that had fought with genuine effectiveness across 2 years of desert campaigning were now running low on ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies simultaneously. Casualty evacuation had become nearly impossible. Men who would have been moved to rear-area hospitals in earlier phases of the campaign were now being treated in forward aid stations that were themselves within artillery range. Into this situation came American medical units, operating under the doctrinal framework they had drilled in training. The 34th Infantry Division's medical detachments, along with those of the 1st and 9th Divisions, were processing casualties from some of the heaviest fighting American forces had yet experienced in the European theatre. The aid stations were overwhelmed. The triage decisions were being made fast, in bad light, under intermittent fire, with limited supplies, and no clear expectation of when resupply would arrive. And in these stations, German wounded were being treated before American wounded when the German wounds were worse. For a soldier like Kemper, or for the dozens of documented and representative cases that look like his, the first response was suspicion. This was not an unreasonable response given the context. Prisoners were sometimes treated well for instrumental reasons. Information could be extracted from a man who was conscious and in reduced pain. The treatment might be a prelude to interrogation. The morphine might be something other than morphine. The suspicion had a rational structure, even if it was, in this instance, wrong. What broke the suspicion was not reassurance. None of the medics working those stations had the time, or in most cases, the language for reassurance. What broke it was observation. A German soldier alert enough to watch what was happening around him could see that the same calculus was being applied to the Americans in the station. A GI with a through-and-through shoulder wound sat on an ammunition crate, waiting while the medic finished with the German who had come in with his intestines perforated. A corporal with a broken arm walked in under his own power and was told, in gestures if not words, to sit down and wait. The man with the sucking chest wound went next, regardless of what he was wearing. Some of the German wounded in those Tunisian stations wrote home about what had happened to them, in letters that passed through censorship and survived in family collections, and eventually in military archives. The letters share a tone that is difficult to characterize precisely. It is not gratitude, exactly, or not only that. It is closer to disorientation. Several writers circle the same observation without quite naming it. The Americans treated me as though the wound were the only relevant fact. One letter, cited in a 1991 study of Axis prisoner experiences in Allied custody, described the moment a medic bypassed 2 sitting Americans to reach the German writer's stretcher with a phrase that translates roughly, as he looked at me the way a carpenter looks at a joint that needs fixing. There was no feeling in it. That was the strangest part. There was no feeling in it, and yet here I am. What the medics themselves thought about it is a more complicated question than the outcome suggests. The men of the Army Medical Corps were not, as a group, idealists. They came from the same towns and the same economic circumstances as the infantry they served alongside, held broadly the same range of political opinions, carried the same prejudices and the same loyalties. A significant number of them had close relatives in the Pacific Theatre, or had lost friends in the months since they entered combat. Some of them had come through the early disasters of Kasserine Pass and carried the specific cold anger that comes from watching men you know die in conditions that feel avoidable. To suggest that treating a German casualty ahead of an American one was a morally uncomplicated act for the men performing it would be false, and the testimony available makes clear it was not. What the doctrine did, and what its architects may have understood they were doing when they codified it so precisely, was remove the decision from the moral domain before it could be contested there. A medic in a forward aid station in Tunisia or Italy or the Hürtgen forest was not asked to feel a particular way about the German on the stretcher in front of him. He was asked to read the wound, assess the urgency, and act. The field manual supplied the framework. The training had made the framework automatic. The result was that a man could treat an enemy soldier first, with technical precision and without visible sentiment, and when the task was finished, walk to the next case without having resolved anything about how he felt. The protocol had already resolved it for him. Not every medic experienced this as relief. Sergeant Harold Stein of the 1st Infantry Division's Medical Battalion, whose account was collected by the division's historian in 1946, described treating a German machine gunner near El Geta with a chest wound that would have killed him in under 20 minutes without intervention. Stein worked on him for close to half an hour. The German survived, was processed through the POW system, and was eventually repatriated. Stein said in his account that he could not remember feeling anything in particular during the procedure and found that fact mildly troubling in retrospect. He had done what the manual said. He had done it well. He was not certain whether this made him a good soldier or whether it made him something he didn't have a word for. Others described the doctrine not as a removal of feeling, but as its clarification. One medic from the 34th Division, interviewed decades later for an oral history project on North African veterans, said that treating everyone the same way had been the only thing in the entire war that felt unambiguous. Everything else involved compromise or improvisation or looking away from something. Triage was the one place where the rule was the rule, and the rule held. He had found that, in the conditions in which he was working, something that simply held was worth more than he could easily express. The paradox at the center of all of this testimony is that a system designed to be emotionally neutral, to extract the medic's personal investment from the decision, consistently produced outcomes that the recipients experienced as profound. Not because the medic felt something extraordinary, often because he felt nothing extraordinary at all. He came, he assessed, he treated, he moved on. And the German soldier left behind, now bandaged and injected and alive, had to build some account of what had just happened to him with the cognitive tools his own culture had provided. Those tools were not well suited to the task. The Italian campaign gave the encounter a new dimension. By the winter of 1943 and into 1944, the fighting in Italy had settled into the particular misery of the Gustav Line. The terrain had rendered mechanized advantages largely irrelevant and returned the war to something closer to the static attrition of the previous generation, with infantry fighting for ridgelines and river crossings and abbey walls at a cost measured in men per metre of ground. The casualty rates on both sides were severe enough that the distinction between forward and rear area had become somewhat theoretical. Aid stations operated under conditions that fluctuated between difficult and impossible, depending on the day, the weather, and the progress of the fighting overhead. It was in this context, in the mountains south of Rome during the grinding approach to Cassino, that an encounter occurred that became, in a modest way, documented. Hauptmann Wilhelm Dressler, a company commander in the 71st Infantry Division, was wounded during a counterattack near the village of San Angelo in Theodis in early February of 1944. A burst of machine gun fire caught him across the left side, fracturing 2 ribs and lacerating his flank. He was conscious but losing blood at a rate that made movement difficult, and his unit had been cut off from its own medical support by the collapse of the attack. He was found by a patrol from the 36th Infantry Division, Texas National Guard, and brought into an American forward aid station. What distinguished Dressler's case from others like it was his rank, and what his rank meant in the triage calculation. There were American enlisted men waiting in that station. Dressler, as a Hauptmann, was the equivalent of a captain, and in the Wehrmacht's own ordering of priority, an officer outranked an enlisted man in nearly every practical circumstance, including medical attention. In the American aid station, none of this was relevant. His wound was assessed. His wound was worse than the wounds of the American enlisted men waiting ahead of him in the informal queue. He was moved to the front of the queue. Dressler wrote about this after the war in a memoir that was published in a small West German edition in 1958 and translated partially by an American military historian in the 1980s. His account of the moment is careful in the way that a man is careful when he is describing something that still hasn't entirely resolved for him. He had expected, at best, to be treated after the Americans. He had expected, as an officer of enemy rank, to be treated with a degree of hostility that would have been understandable given what he represented and where they were. Instead, he found himself on a stretcher being worked on while men who shared the nationality of the medic treating him sat against the wall and waited. He asked the interpreter, when one became available, why this had happened. The interpreter was a Pennsylvanian of German descent named Kovacs, who had been attached to the unit precisely for situations like this. Kovacs explained, as Dressler recalled it, that the medical people went by the wound, not by who the man was. Dressler wrote that he received this explanation and could find nowhere to put it. His entire framework for understanding military behavior, his own included, rested on the premise that identity preceded function. You were German, then you were an officer, then you were a wounded man. The Americans appeared to have inverted this so completely that they had, in the practical application of the principle, arrived at something he recognized as a kind of absolute. You were a wounded man. The rest was secondary. He was not certain he believed in the framework that produced this, but he could not argue with what it had produced. The ideological weight of this specific situation, an enemy officer treated before Allied enlisted men, was not lost on the American medical personnel either. Several who served in Italy in this period and gave post-war accounts mentioned similar incidents with a matter-of-factness that is itself revealing. They were not proud of it in any demonstrative sense. They were not troubled by it. It had been the correct clinical decision. They had made it. If it happened to mean that a German officer received care before an American private, that was an outcome the doctrine had already accounted for, and they had been trained in the doctrine. What the Germans made of all this, once they had survived it and passed through the prisoner of war processing system, emerged slowly and through several channels. The International Committee of the Red Cross conducted regular inspections of Allied prisoner of war camps in Britain, the United States, and North Africa throughout the war, and their reports from the early and middle years document a baseline of physical treatment that surprised even the inspectors who had developed a professionally calibrated pessimism about what they would find. Medical treatment of German prisoners in Allied custody was, by the standards the inspectors were accustomed to encountering, unusually consistent. The discrepancy between the written provisions of the Geneva Convention and the actual practice in the camps was narrow in the Allied system in a way that the inspectors noted explicitly because their experience of Axis camps, particularly those holding Soviet prisoners, had made them accustomed to a much wider gap. The prisoner accounts fed into a body of testimony that historians of the Second World War began collecting seriously in the 1950s. The German veterans' accounts of their medical treatment at the point of capture form a coherent cluster across different theatres and different years, and what is coherent about them is not the emotional tone, which varies considerably, but the specific detail they return to, the surprise, the suspicion that followed the surprise, the gradual, reluctant comprehension, and underneath all of it, a difficulty that none of the men quite overcame. The American system had treated them according to a principle that their own framework had no comfortable place for. The German propaganda apparatus was structurally unable to do anything useful with this information. The function of propaganda in any military system is to harden the distinction between us and them, to construct the enemy as something that justifies the cost of fighting him. Evidence that the enemy's medical corps treated your wounded with professional impartiality and occasionally ahead of their own men was not evidence that could be incorporated into that construction without dissolving it. Several captured German soldiers who gave this account to Allied interrogators noted that they had not mentioned it to their own officers before capture, not because they had been ordered not to, but because they had not known how to frame it. It did not fit the story they had been told. It fit the story the Americans were telling, which was not a story they had been encouraged to believe. Within the Wehrmacht's own internal assessments, There is evidence that the asymmetry between German medical practice at the front and the formal provisions of the Geneva Convention was known, and was a source of at least administrative unease. The Eastern Front had made the gap impossible to ignore, because the scale of Soviet casualties in German custody was not something that could be attributed to resource constraints alone, and everyone who thought carefully about it knew it. What the encounters with American medical practice in North Africa and Italy added to this picture was a mirror. The German soldier, treated by an American medic, was looking at a system that had taken the stated principle and actually built it into the reflex behavior of its frontline personnel. Whatever one thought about the principle itself, the execution was not in doubt. The letters, the Red Cross reports, the post-war memoirs, the oral history collections, all of it pointed in the same direction. Something had happened in those aid stations that the Germans who passed through them could not explain within the vocabulary their own war had given them. Most of them stopped trying to explain it. They filed it, alongside other inexplicable things, under a heading that their language supplies, and that translates approximately as the way it was. But the inexplicability itself is the evidence. When a system surprises the people it encounters so consistently, and surprises them in the same specific way, it is not surprising them by accident. The winter of 1944 was the point at which the doctrine was most severely tested, and the point at which what it actually required of the men applying it became most visible. By December, the Allied advance that had seemed, in September, to be approaching its conclusion had stalled along a front line running from the Netherlands, through the Ardennes, and down toward the Swiss border. The German offensive that began on the 16th of December caught the Allied line at its thinnest point. In terrain the command had assessed as unlikely to produce major action, and in the opening days produced a chaos of encirclement, broken communications, and mass casualties that overwhelmed medical infrastructure across the entire sector. Aid stations that had been functioning as rear area facilities found themselves at the front or behind it. Medics who had worked under pressure before found themselves working under a different order of pressure entirely, in temperatures that fell below zero, with frozen ground that made digging impossible and exposed positions that could not be improved. Into the aid stations came, among others, soldiers of the Waffen-SS. This requires a pause, because the Waffen-SS in the Ardennes offensive was not a random selection from the German military. The units committed to the attack's northern shoulder, in particular the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, under the command of Wilhelm Mohnke, had a record that the American soldiers in the sector were not unaware of. The massacre at Borgnes Crossroads, where soldiers of Kampfgruppe Piper shot 84 American prisoners of war in a field on the 17th of December, was known through the American lines within hours. Word moves fast in a collapsing situation, and word of Borgnes moved faster than most. By the time wounded from SS units began appearing at American aid stations in the days that followed, the men staffing those stations knew what the insignia on the collar meant. Technician 5th grade Raymond Burrell, a medic with the 30th Infantry Division who gave a recorded account to the division's history project in 1947, described treating 2 wounded SS soldiers at a forward station near Stavelot on the 20th of December, 3 days after Borgnes. He knew about Borgnes. Everyone in his unit knew about Borgnes. He assessed the wounds of both men, determined that one required immediate surgical intervention and one could wait, and proceeded accordingly. He said in his account that he did not feel anything he could identify as compassion toward either man during the procedure. He felt, as best he could reconstruct it, concentration. The wound presented a set of clinical facts. He addressed those facts. He said that when he was finished and had moved on to the next case, he had a moment of something he described as blankness, and then that passed, and he kept working. He was asked by the interviewer whether he had any regrets about treating the men. He said the question didn't make sense to him. The doctrine didn't have a regret provision. He had followed the doctrine. Not every medic in the Ardennes found it as clean as Burrell described. Several accounts from that period acknowledge a struggle that Burrell either did not experience or did not record, a moment between the assessment and the action where the man lying on the stretcher was not, for a fraction of a second, a wound with a clinical priority. He was what his uniform said he was. And then the training reasserted itself, and he became a wound again, and the work continued. What is notable about even the most conflicted accounts from this period is that the doctrine held, in the conditions most likely to break it, extreme cold, mass casualties, specific knowledge of enemy atrocities committed days before in the same sector of the same battle, the American Army Medical Corps applied its triage principles to SS soldiers with the same professional consistency it had applied them to regular Wehrmacht soldiers in Tunisia and Italy. The men who did this were not saints. The record does not support the sentimental version of the story. What it supports is something harder to admire and in some ways more impressive. A doctrine that had been built and trained deeply enough to function in conditions that would have overwhelmed any system dependent on individual virtue. For the SS soldiers who were treated, the experience produced accounts broadly similar in structure to those from earlier theatres, with one addition. Several noted, in post-war interviews and in the handful of written records that survive from German veterans of the Ardennes, that the treatment arrived with the specific weight of what they knew had happened at Bognes. They knew. They knew that the men treating them knew. The silence in those aid stations, on that subject, was a specific kind of silence. One veteran, quoted in a 1993 German study of Waffen-SS veterans' post-war recollections, described the American medic working on him as appearing not to see him at all, in the sense that the medic appeared to be looking only at the wound. He said he had not decided, by the time he was evacuated, whether this was the most professional thing he had ever encountered or the most frightening. What all of this amounted to, taken together across the 3 years and 3 theatres in which American medical practice made this specific impression on the borders. Those borders had been drawn by politics and ideology and a particular reading of history. They held until the moment a man lay bleeding in an American aid station, and then the American doctrine crossed them without ceremony, without sentiment, and without asking permission. The men who made this possible did not all survive it. Combat medics in the Second World War were non-combatants under the Geneva Convention, identified by the Red Cross on their helmets and their armbands, prohibited from carrying offensive weapons, and prohibited from being deliberately targeted. The prohibition was honoured with varying degrees of consistency by different forces in different theatres. In the Pacific, it was honoured very little. In Europe, it was honoured more, but more is not always, and the distinction between a medic moving toward a casualty and a soldier moving toward a position was not always resolvable from a distance. In poor light, in the middle of a firefight, American medics died treating German wounded. This is in the record, and it is not ambiguous. Men who had crossed open ground to reach a casualty wearing the wrong uniform were killed doing it, by fire that may or may not have recognized what they were. Technician 4th grade Harold Garman received the Medal of Honor for actions near Montholon, France, in August of 1944. His citation describes him crossing open ground under direct fire to treat wounded men, refusing to take cover while casualties remained in the open. He treated Americans and Germans alike in the same action. He survived. Not everyone who performed equivalent actions did. The medics who treated German wounded first because the German wounds were worse were not making a statement about Germany. They were not expressing admiration for the men they were treating, or approval of the cause those men had served, or forgiveness for what those men may have done. They were executing a principle that someone, somewhere in the institutional history of the American Army Medical Corps, had decided was worth building into the bone of the organization. That decision cost some of them their lives. The Germans they treated went home. Some of those Germans wrote about it. Most of them wrote about it with the specific tone of men who have been given something they know they didn't earn and aren't sure they deserved, and who have been carrying the weight of that uncertainty ever since. The weight is appropriate. Men who passed through it was a coherent revelation about the nature of the institution producing it. The American military was not, and made no serious claim to be, a morally superior collection of individuals. Its soldiers committed crimes in this war. Its command made decisions that cost lives unnecessarily. Its treatment of its own minority soldiers within the military system was, throughout much of the conflict, a direct and documented contradiction of the values it claimed to be fighting for. None of that is absent from the full record. The claim being made here is narrower and more verifiable. That American Army Medical Corps triage doctrine codified a principle of human equivalence at the point of medical need, trained its personnel in that principle until it was reliable under fire, and produced outcomes consistent with that principle in conditions ranging from a collapsing Tunisian front to a frozen Belgian crossroads. The German military had not done this. Not because German military medicine was incompetent, and not because the Geneva Convention language was unavailable to it. The Wehrmacht's medical system had access to the same treaty, trained personnel of equivalent skill, and in many individual cases produced practitioners of genuine integrity. What it had not done was build the principle into the institutional reflex deeply enough to hold when the pressure came. When resources were constrained, when casualties were high, when the men on the other side of the calculation were Slavic, or Jewish, or simply Allied rather than German, the priority ordering that the Wehrmacht's culture had embedded revealed itself. The gap between the written policy and the frontline practice was, in some theatres, measureless. The difference was not individual virtue, it was institutional architecture. The Americans had built a system in which the individual medic's personal feelings about the man on the stretcher were structurally irrelevant to the outcome. That system was the product of choices made by administrators, medical officers, and doctrine writers in the interwar period who had decided, for reasons that mixed humanitarian principle with operational pragmatism, to anchor the triage protocol in severity rather than identity. The result was a machine that produced a specific kind of justice in the field, not perfectly and not everywhere, but consistently enough that the men who encountered it on the receiving end remembered it for the rest of their lives and struggled to account for it. What it revealed, finally, was the gap between a military that believed it was fighting for something that could in principle be extended to any human being, and one that had decided, at the level of foundational assumption, that the category of human being worth full consideration had. What happened in those aid stations was not normal. It was the product of a sustained institutional effort to make something difficult into something automatic, and the cost of that effort was borne by men who had no part in the decision and no guarantee of surviving the execution. They did it anyway, because the doctrine said to, and because the doctrine had been built deeply enough into them that in the moment it was indistinguishable from instinct. These stories cost something to live through. They cost more to act out, in the cold and the noise and the specific fear of a man crossing open ground towards someone who might not recognize the red cross on his arm. The least they deserve is to be remembered with the precision the men themselves brought to the work. Names, wounds, decisions, outcomes. The arithmetic of who lived, because someone chose the right protocol in the worst possible conditions. That record exists. It is worth knowing. Be part of that. I'll see you next time.